The times they are a-changin'. That was the tune that kept running through my mind as I read the lessons for this morning. In some cases, the reason was obvious, in others, a little bit less so, but it seemed to underlie everything. Things are changing. The passage from Jeremiah telegraphs this pretty clearly. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. The fact that there's a new covenant on the way implies that there was a former covenant, and a change is on the way. In the reading from John's Gospel, again, a change is announced pretty clearly, more than once. The hour has come for the Son of Man or the human one to be glorified. Now I am deeply troubled. Now is the time for the judgment of this world. Now this world's ruler will be thrown out. Now implies before or then. A time or situation that's calling for a change. And then the passage from the Psalms suggests a desired big change in a very personal way. In your great compassion, blot out my offenses, wash me through and through from my wickedness, and cleanse me from my sin. So what's changing in these situations? And why should we pay attention? We'll start with Jeremiah and the circumstances he was addressing. He was active around the time that the Jews were exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. For the Jews, just the psychological impact of being exiled would have been huge. They would have wondered, has God forsaken us? Why? Jeremiah has some answers, to be sure, but as I thought a bit more about it, there were a couple of other significant changes brought about by exile. The first was that Judah, even as a semi-independent nation state, ceased to exist. A puppet government was established by the Babylonians, but the previous king and his court were taken into exile. Those exiled Jews had to rethink, to change their idea of what it meant to be a Jewish people, one without a homeland. And then 70 years later, they would return. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. Would things be the same? Or had Judaism changed forever? The days are coming, says Jeremiah. The time has come now, says Jesus in John's Gospel, picking up Jeremiah's prophecy, also pointing to a change. The cause for this change, however, is less clear. And to be honest, pursuing an answer to that was what caused me to ask, what's changed? On the surface, there's little to point to a critical moment. Recall the story. During the Passover festival, some Greeks who happened to be in the crowd approached Philip and asked, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Once that request makes its way to Jesus, his reaction is not to rush and meet with the Greeks, but rather to respond to Philip and Andrew, the time has come for the human one to be glorified. What changed? What made the time now? Just because some Greeks wanted to see Jesus? As I spent this time this week pondering this, it occurred to me that what was changing in both of these instances was the nature of Judaism, or more broadly, the nature of a national or tribal religion. With regard to Jeremiah's context, the nation of Judah was dissolved. For centuries, there had been such a nation, descended from Jacob and ruled by Davidic kings. It was a national homeland with theoretically a national religion for the people. Jerusalem was the religious and political center. Its destruction called into question a religion that was based on place. Hints of the trauma this caused are scattered throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, much wondering about how or why God would forsake the city of David. allowing the chosen people to be scattered time and time again. Change number one: no more geographically based religion. Likewise, the destruction of the temples, both Solomon's and then Herod's, threw into question a huge proportion of the laws found in the Torah. Setting aside the various rules about which animals were worthy, how sacrifices should be conducted, and which portion of the sacrificial animals should go to the priests, many of the other laws required some temple ritual. For example, if someone fulfilled a religious vow, something needed to be done at the temple. So with the temple and its ritual gone, change number two: no more religion solely based on sacrifice. John, in his gospel, brings us to another change moment this morning. Throughout the first 12 and a half chapters, the evangelist has told us of Jesus' meetings with all sorts of Jewish folks, from fishermen to Pharisees, undistinguished folks and officials. And as a hint of what was to come, Jesus has some significant conversations with those rogue cousins, the Samaritans. But the pivot point is what we witness today: the arrival of Greeks seeking Jesus. What had been confined to an ethnic group, Jews and Samaritans shared a common ancestor, Jacob, and a common expectation, a Messiah. What had been confined to an ethnic group was no longer solely theirs alone. Something in Jesus' activities and message broke through those ethnic constraints. Given what the evangelist tells us, the significance and implications of the situation affects Jesus as well. Now I am deeply troubled. What should I say? Father, save me from this time? No, for this reason I have come to this time. Father, glorify your name. Change number three: no more religion based on ethnicity. The glory of God's name will be universally recognized, even if it takes Jesus to the cross to drive home the full and true nature of the changes. Major change events. People finding themselves in situations where moorings were snatched away. And what then happened in response? What changed? With regard to the loss of a homeland, Jeremiah's exiles held out hope. They never gave up wishing to sing the songs of Zion again in Zion. And after several generations, they were able to go and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. The state of the state, however, was never the same again. For most of the next several centuries, Judea was a vassal of one empire or another, finally falling just a few decades after Jesus' death. But something did change. With the two destructions of Jerusalem, being Jewish became less connected to a homeland and more to a religious ethnic identity. Ask, even today, what is a Jew? And the easiest answer is, it's complicated. But there is an identity with some connection to an ancient story, but not necessarily to a particular set of rituals or even a place. But related to that change is another. Jewish religious identity reemerged without temple ritual at its core. What the Jews learned through their meditations on the law while in Babylon helped create a new religious center. Faithfulness in God was not found primarily in correctly slaughtering a lamb, but as imagined by the psalmist in another place, let my prayers be in your sight as the incense, the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice. Temple rituals were replaced by study and prayerful devotion, something that could be done anywhere. It should be no surprise that synagogues today might be called Temple Sinai or Temple Israel, a very long ways from Jerusalem, but places where God might be found. The trajectory of the changes found their resolution in what we heard this morning. No longer were God's people limited by geography. No longer were God's people limited to worship in a particular building with a particular set of ancient rituals. And then reflected in John's gospel, no longer are God's people limited to one race or ethnicity. God's people are those that, as Jeremiah prophesied, have a new covenant written on their hearts. That grain of wheat that had been planted in Israel when the Hebrews entered Canaan had died. And it became much fruit, potentially feeding the whole world. Jesus invites us to recognize that pattern, so familiar to an agrarian society, and to make it real in our lives, in our time. Jesus invites us to let go of those things to which we cling, even our very selves, for the welfare of all. This is what a heart-based covenant looks like, recognizing when it's time to turn from self-interest to service of others. So God is calling us to something new and challenging, a summons very appropriate for Lent. It's not easy to be called to let go of old, static covenants based on assumptions or external rules or old identities, and then to mine the treasures of God's living word written on our hearts. Yet we are called to let the seeds of our lives fall into God's rich, ever-changing soil, to die and reemerge, changed into new forms that can bear much fruit for ourselves and for those around us. And now it is the time. Create in me a clean heart, O God.